I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast.
I'm proud to be an American. Why? Why is being born in a certain time at a certain place something to take pride in? Is it the indoctrination of nationalism that, invades our culture and our everyday conversations, that slowly degrades the foundations of societies across the world? There's nothing wrong with taking pride in what we do, what we achieve, what we accomplish, what we create. We take pride in these because we worked for them. Pride, however, carries a bit of a stigma, so much so that there are entire lesson manuals in the Mormon Church about what they call the pride cycle. The pride cycle from the Book of Mormon goes like this. The chosen people of God are super duper righteous, and then God blesses them with wealth and prosperity for their righteousness. Then they become prideful and forget that God is responsible for giving them all of their worldly possessions. They fall away from God, and then God curses them, thus destroying everything that he gave them to generate that pride to begin with, killing their friends and families, and often burning their cities to the ground. This causes the chosen people to be humbled by all of these curses of God. Therefore, they become righteous again because of this humbling and change in skin color, of course, to whiteness and delightsomeness, and then God begins to bless them again. The cycle then repeats, and thus we have what is known to Mormons as the pride cycle. It exists within the macro with various cities and groups of people in the Book of Mormon, but it's also a pattern that emerges when considering the entire narrative of the Book of Mormon's 3,000-year story. Just like any work of literature, the Book of Mormon contains lessons that we can take from its pages that are never printed in any church-printed manual for any actual instruction. We can't have the masses actually pondering their existence and morality beyond what we tell them, can we? Nobody's going to give you the knowledge that you need to overthrow them. Whether it's the noble, unwilling leader that's rising to greatness in a time of calamity, or three magi wandering time and space, three Nephites, and they're teaching mortals the mysteries of existence, or a promising underdog who overcomes great trials and receives recognition from a member of high society, or initiates learning their strengths and their weaknesses, the cycle of life and death and the rebirth of people and nations, the dichotomies of peace and war, light and dark, good and evil, wealth and poverty. The Book of Mormon actually does contain some storytelling elements of chaos and hermetic philosophy that are worth exploration in the abstract, of course, ignoring the claims of divinity. It's because of these deeper lessons, all replete throughout what we consider the great classic literature, that nuanced believers can consider the Book of Mormon as divinely inspired while not being actual history. Those people, those nuanced believers, see divinely inspired lessons in every work of art, literature, and philosophy, regardless of whether or not the work claims to be scripture. I see these lessons, too, without any appeal to the divine origin. They're stories. They're all stories that have existed for thousands of years, and they underpin nearly every element of philosophical exploration, whether art, philosophy, stories, whatever. We take these lessons, we repackage them, and we change the names of the protagonist and the antagonist, and then we retell a different story with the same lesson underneath it all. Every story has been told. Every word has been spoken. The more of these stories we consume, the more we see the connective threads, the more the strings that tug on reality come into focus. Only then can we spread our wings to fly far away from these simplistic and elementary teachings and then begin to teach the actual true lessons to the next generation. Somehow, someday, I hope you'll understand. Samantha Payne, a schoolmate of Joseph Smith in Manchester, New York, said in 1880 that, quote, Joseph was regarded as a braggadocio, end quote, among many other things. Confidence is an attractive feature, but confidence, like every other character trait, is a tool that can be wielded for good and evil alike. Confidence has a few ugly twins: arrogance, narcissism, audacity, and taken to extremes, confidence can morph into a God complex. Joseph Smith's arrogance is clearly rooted in his childhood, just like every other narcissist who preceded and followed him. According to a New York neighbor named Daniel Hendricks, Lucy Mack Smith was, quote, a great admirer of her son Joseph, despite his shiftless and provoking ways. She always declared that he was born with a genius and did not have to work, end quote. According to Hendricks, Lucy once remarked that, quote, the boy will be able some of these days to buy the whole of Palmyra and all the folks in it. You don't know what a brain my boy has under that old hat, end quote. Neighbor Wallace Minor, on whose land Joe dug a 20-foot cave, claimed that Mother Lucy Mack Smith, quote, was told in a dream that she would give birth to a son who would be a great leader, end quote. Orsimus Turner, a local historian, wrote in 1851 that, quote, the incipient hints, the first givings out that a prophet was to spring from her humble household came from her, end quote. In a large family with scarce resources, arrogance became a survival mechanism to get more attention and therefore resources than his siblings. This evolved beyond the Smith family dynamics, and it became a success formula in Joseph Smith's teenage years, episodes 10, 11, and 12. Joe carefully crafted a reputation in Palmyra as a powerful seer and conjurer during his treasure-digging days, but in the Book of Mormon, he took the myth of Joseph Smith to the next level. One might call it the Joseph Smith. Get it? Smith. Joseph Smith. Okay, I'll see myself out. In the autobiographical first portion of the Book of Mormon, in 2 Nephi chapter 3, the prophet Lehi is on his deathbed, and he's speaking to his son Nephi. This is what Lehi says, quote, for behold, thou art the fruit of my loins, and I am a descendant of Joseph, who was carried captive into Egypt. For Joseph truly testified, saying, a seer shall the Lord my God rise up, who shall be a choice seer unto the fruit of my loins. Yea, Joseph truly said, thus saith the Lord unto me, a choice seer will I raise up out of the fruit of thy loins, and he shall be esteemed highly among the fruit of thy loins. And unto him will I give commandment that he shall do a work for the fruit of thy loins, his brethren, which shall be of a great worth unto them, even to the bringing of them to the knowledge of the covenants which I have made with thy fathers. And I will give unto him a commandment, that he shall do none other work, save the work which I shall command him. And I will make him great in mine eyes, for he shall do my work. And he shall be great like unto Moses, whom I have said I would raise up unto you to deliver my people, O house of Israel. And out of weakness he shall be made strong. In that day when my work shall commence among all my people, unto the restoring thee, O house of Israel, saith the Lord. And thus prophesied Joseph, saying, behold, that seer will the Lord bless, and they that seek to destroy him shall be confounded. For this promise which I have obtained of the Lord, of the fruit of my loins, shall be fulfilled. Behold, I am sure of the fulfilling of this promise. And his name, this is the choice here, and his name shall be called after me, and it shall be after the name of his father. And he shall be like unto me. For the thing which the Lord shall bring forth by his hand, by the power of the Lord, shall bring my people unto salvation. End quote. Mormons are taught in Sunday school that this is the Book of Mormon prophecy of Joseph Smith. He shall be called after his father, which is after my name, Joseph. But if we view the Book of Mormon not as ancient history, but as a product of Joe's own mind, Joe produced this ancient book of Scripture, and into it he wrote a prophecy about himself, a future choice seer named Joseph, the son of Joseph, descended from the Book of Mormon prophet Nephi and the biblical prophet Joseph of Egypt. He will be great like Moses. He'll save the entire world, and anyone who dares oppose him will be crushed by the power of God. And absolutely my favorite part God commands him to not do any work except the work of God. Remember a few episodes ago when we went through, 30 pages of script about Joe's idleness and his desire to avoid physical labor at all costs? That revelation about him not having any strength in temporal labors also makes its way into the Book of Mormon prophecy about Joseph Smith. All things considered, if writing a new book of Scripture as a sequel to the Bible weren't audacious enough, writing a prophecy about himself into that book of Scripture says a lot about Joe's character and his opinion of himself. Episode 17. Joe didn't stop at writing himself into the Book of Mormon. That wasn't enough for him, so he also created his own inspired revision of the Bible. And he, quote, restored a lot of plain and precious parts that he claimed had been removed from the Bible by all of the evil Catholics, including a version of that same choice seer prophecy that appears in the Book of Mormon. In his Genesis chapter 50, it has 11 and a half brand new verses, all about the future coming son of Joseph, this choice seer, Joseph, son of Joseph. I'm not going to read those to you because they're basically copy-pasted right out of that Book of Mormon passage that we just read a little bit ago. So many Christians consider Joseph Smith or Mormonism to be antichrist or heretical. The charge is understandable when we consider the sanctity of the Bible itself and Joe's audacity in writing his own version of the Bible to complement all his other own scriptures and revelations that he wrote, claiming that they came straight from God. The very act of writing new scripture is arrogant to begin with, but I want to examine an aspect of Joe's scriptures that bears strict scrutiny. White supremacy, the most caustic, divisive, and deadly and hereditary of all versions of arrogance. People will often claim that Joseph wasn't progressive, considering that he ordained a black man, Elijah Abel, into the priesthood. Well, Elijah Abel was rather, to use Mormon terminology, he was a rather white and delightsome African American, and it's unclear whether Joe even knew that Abel had African ancestry, or maybe Joe ordained Abel as an example of how a black man can become righteous enough that his skin will turn white and delightsome. It eventually was Brigham Young who applied the curse of Cain to black people and then barred them from getting the priesthood as an official stance of the church, but he built that priesthood ban policy on teachings from the scriptures that Joseph Smith wrote. Joe's own priesthood discrimination is far more conjectural and it's less defined than Bloody Brigham's, but it still comes from his mind. In Joe's translation of Genesis, he makes some changes to the Bible story in which Noah gets drunk and his son Ham makes fun of him. In the original Bible story, after Noah sobers up, he curses Ham's son Canaan to be a servant to his brothers. In Joe's version of the story, Noah's cursing of Canaan includes not only servitude, but also black skin. And I quote, "There was a blackness come upon all the children of Canaan, that they were despised among all people." That's not in the actual regular Bible. That's in only Joseph Smith's revision of the Bible. He continues, "Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants, shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant, and a veil of darkness shall come over him, that he shall be known among all men." End quote. Joe provided a religious explanation for keeping black people in slavery, just like every other anti-abolitionist Christian of his time. His explanation, however, didn't involve interpretation of biblical verses so much as rewriting biblical verses to say what he wanted them to say that justified slavery. Not just justified, commanded slavery. The Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible, the Book of Moses, the Book of Abraham, and the Doctrine and Covenants, all of them include multiple passages of white supremacy and manifest destiny. And of course, we don't have to discuss the damage caused to humanity by these elitist concepts because we've discussed them ad nauseum on this show as well as on Glassbox Podcast, episodes 165, 170, 189, and 214. As Joe's ministry matured, he continued to elevate himself above all else. Whether it was dissenters in the ranks, skin color discrimination, or it was rival religious groups, or religious instruction concerning the mysteries of God's kingdom, Joe always needed to be the epicenter of expertise and attention in his religious group. A cult of personality centered around the religious dicta of one man is just a religious cult. Joe hoarded the limelight and attention of any group of people anytime he was in a room. It was a polarizing character trait that served to build him up and tear him down at different points in his life. In Kirtland, we see a dramatic example of this when we examine the Doctrine and Covenants and the Book of Abraham. In August of 1835, Oliver Cowdery, Cowdung all over, because nicknames are hard. You know what? Screw it. I'm proud of that one as one of my earliest creations, even if it wasn't my best work. Cowdung all over presented the Doctrine and Covenants to the church leadership, and a bunch of the guys got up and testified that they were indeed true, and then they all voted to accept the Doctrine and Covenants as Scripture. Now, here's kind of the weird part about this. Most of these revelations had already been published a few years earlier in the 1833 Book of Commandments, which had a limited printing because the Missouri mob burned down the Mormons' printing press in the middle of production, making the surviving copies super rare. So, listeners, if one of you has a Book of Commandments, give me a call. I'm sure we can work something out, and my dignity is dirt cheap. Now, the church republished those revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835 with the Lectures on Faith as part of the production. The Lectures on Faith were the doctrine part, and the revelations reprinted from the Book of Commandments became the Covenants, thus Doctrine and Covenants. So it was published in 1835. But Joe and a committee of other church leaders heavily edited the revelations in between these two publications with only 2 years separating them. There are thousands and thousands of differences between the 1833 Book of Commandments and the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. And yet, these are supposed to be revelations from God. That same God that said, "I'm the same yesterday, today, and forever," changed his mind. Now, if I'm God, and I give my words to a prophet, and within 2 years, that miscreant makes radical changes to the words that I gave him, I'd be pretty mad. Maybe I'd even curse that guy for changing my unchangeable words. These words in the Doctrine and Covenants, these are supposed to be the immutable truths meant to be passed down through generations of believers in me. And they have the arrogance to change the words that came out of my mouth through my mouthpiece, who I went through the trouble of appearing to the woods in just 10 years earlier. How dare you, Joseph Smith? How dare you think that you know the mind of God better than God himself? In all seriousness, what this means is either God messed up or Joe had to retcon God's words in order to fit an evolving narrative as his ministry matured. This is maddening to me because people often talk about thousands of edits that were made in the Book of Mormon like that's a problem to the narrative. It is, right? It absolutely is, because that's scriptures that are supposedly translated from gold plates, and Joe just decided to edit them, make thousands of edits. Most of them are grammatical, sure, I get that, but still there are some, significant actual edits in there. It is a problem, but what about the tens of thousands of changes in the Doctrine and Covenants? Well, why don't we talk about that more? Maybe Joe made an error in translating the gold plates, but there's absolutely no excuse for changing the direct revelations from God after those revelations were initially dictated. Friend of the show, Joel Kuhn, also known as Indiana, made an awesome tool for comparing the different versions of the Doctrine and Covenants at comparedndc.com. Look it up. See for yourself just how much God apparently changes his mind about consequential and important stuff in early Mormonism. Or you can just listen to My Book of Mormon podcast and you hear all about the differences in historical context. The Doctrine and Covenants are one thing in all of this, but let's also talk about the Book of Abraham. We need to discuss a guy named Antonio Libolo. Antonio Libolo was the superintendent over a huge archaeological dig site in Egypt between 1818 and 1822. He was tasked with coordinating the discovered and stolen artifacts, and he amassed a large collection of these Egyptian papyri and mummies and sarcophagi and, statues and all kinds of artifacts from ancient Egypt to be shipped to a collector in New York, where a guy named Michael Chandler was able to purchase a whole bunch of these artifacts for resale. Michael Chandler went and paraded these mummies and papyri around the East Coast from 1833 to 1835, selling some of them, and then also, of course, charging people, a few pennies here and there just to look at these really cool ancient Egyptian artifacts. This is all part of Egyptomania. When the Western cultures became incredibly fascinated with ancient Egyptian, culture and languages, and it was in the process, Western academia was in the process of deciphering the Egyptian language. Well, Michael Chandler made a pretty good living on the road with these artifacts, selling some, exhibiting the others. But his biggest score was awaiting him in Kirtland, Ohio. While Chandler was charging like 25 cents for adults to view the artifacts, he would soon be given $2,400 for the purchase of all the remaining artifacts in his possession. That's about $62,000 of 2020 money. Episode 33. On July 3rd, 1835, Michael Chandler found his way to Kirtland, Ohio, the headquarters of Joseph Smith's church. Now, you may have heard about Joe's miraculous translating abilities and his ability to read Reformed Egyptian, even though that wasn't really a thing. Well, Joe took a look at the papyrus scrolls, and he pronounced them to be the records of the biblical patriarchs Abraham and Joseph. Well, not a single person in America at this time could actually read Egyptian hieroglyphics because the translation process was so early in its development phase. So there was no one to gainsay Joe on this claim. Being the astute artifact dealer he was, Chandler, of course, supported Joe's claim of their origins as a sales tactic. And Chandler even gave Joe a signed certificate that said, quote, "From the information that I could ever learn or meet with about the meaning of these papyri, I find that of Mr. Joseph Smith Jr. to correspond in the most minute matter," end quote. And according to the history of the church, quote, "Soon after this, some of the saints at Kirtland purchased the mummies and papyri, a description of which will appear hereafter, and with W.W. Phelps, Double Up Phelps, and Oliver Cowdery, Cowdung Oliver, as scribes, I commenced the translation of some of the characters or hieroglyphics," end quote. Joe wasn't as interested in the actual mummies, the dead people, as he was in the papyri, but Michael Chandler refused to sell one without the other, so he charged Joe $2,400 for the lot, and then left Kirtland with a smile on his face and his pockets full of coin. Now, apologists will, point to Chandler's signed statement as proof that the Book of Abraham is what Joe claimed it to be. But why would Chandler contradict the almighty prophet of the almighty God when he could sell the artifacts for an order of magnitude to that prophet more than he would have sold them to anybody else? Michael Chandler being a good salesman is a greater indictment of Joe's knowledge and expertise than it is of Chandler's. Joe immediately began translating the papyri, fabricating his stories based on what he thought that he could, make a mythology out of with the papyri as props, basically. But he only got a couple chapters into what would eventually become the Book of Abraham and a little booklet called The Egyptian Alphabet and Grammar before he basically backburnered the project for almost 7 years. The fact that the translations weren't yet complete didn't stop the prophet from leveraging the papyri and the mummies in the meantime. The 4 mummies out of their respective sarcophagi and the papyri were exhibited in Kirtland in the uppermost chamber, the third floor of the Kirtland Temple, once it was completed in early 1836. Joe was way more interested in having real-life antiquities to show off that he would, generate income from. People would pay to see these artifacts, than he wasn't actually translating whatever the papyri actually said, even though he claimed that they were from the hand of the biblical Abraham and Joseph of Egypt. Like, the thing is, exhibiting them as opposed to actually writing the Book of Abraham, one of those things was a moneymaker. The other one required actual effort and creative writing. So, of course, he was going to take the easy way out and just exhibit the things for a little bit of money. But finally, in March of 1842, nearly 7 years after the acquisition of all of this Egyptian collection from Michael Chandler, Joe authored a few more chapters of the Book of Abraham and then published it in the church periodical The Times and Seasons, along with 3 illustrations that were copied from the papyri. Now, Joe's interpretations of these documents obviously doesn't line up with what Egyptologists say they mean, in spite of what any apologist will claim to the contrary. This is such a slam dunk thing. A lot of people will say the Book of Abraham was the final nail in the coffin for me to, believe that the church is not what it claims to be, or that Mormon scripture is not true. The papyri that he purchased, they're just Egyptian funeral documents that were buried with a corpse in order to guide the dead person into the afterlife. They contain magic spells and invocations to various Egyptian gods, but Joe turned the whole thing into an autobiographical account written by the biblical patriarch Abraham, who supposedly lived about 1000 BCE, quote, by his own hand upon papyrus, end quote. Episodes 103 and 104. Unfortunately for Joe, of course, the papyri were made in, first to second century CE. It was only about 1,000 years off the mark. But the Book of Abraham contains plenty more white supremacy, and it serves as the explicit scriptural basis for the priesthood ban. In Joe's translation of the illustration that's known as Facsimile 3, he interprets the black-skinned god Anubis as a slave. And in chapter 1, verses 26 and 27 of the Book of Abraham, we read this, quote, Pharaoh, being a righteous man, established his kingdom and judged his people wisely and justly all his days, seeking earnestly to imitate that order established by the fathers in the first generations, in the days of the first patriarchal reign. The days of Adam. That's what Joe's saying here. Even in the reign of Adam, out there, he said it explicitly, and also of Noah, his father, who blessed him with the blessings of the earth and with the blessings of wisdom, but cursed him as pertaining to the priesthood. Now, Pharaoh, here's where the priesthood ban comes from, now, Pharaoh, being of that lineage by which he could not have the right of priesthood, notwithstanding the Pharaohs would fain claim it from Noah through Ham. Therefore, my father was led away by their idolatry. End quote. So remember, the lineage of Ham was the one that Joe claimed that Noah cursed with dark skin in his translation of the Bible and slavery. Now, Joe is saying that Ham's lineage is also cursed as pertaining to the priesthood. So Brigham Young may have been the one who made it official church policy that black men couldn't be ordained and therefore couldn't actually get to the highest level of Mormon heaven. But Joe was the one who made up the whole white supremacist myth that the policy is based on and then wrote it into Mormon scripture from all eternity to all eternity. That's why anything short of decanonization of this wretched little book of Abraham won't suffice. Burn it. Burn all the books of Abraham. They're pure 19th century white supremacy masquerading as the words of the almighty white supremacist God. The least the church could do today would be to put a disclaimer at the front of their scriptures, talking about them being like a product of their time. That would be a hyper-progressive move, and of course the church is never going to do it. So that's why I advocate for total decanonization of these things. Warner Brothers, they put disclaimers in front of their cartoons from the 1950s. And when a Christian media company, Warner Brothers, that produced such gems as Sunday Go to Meetin' Time, Confederate Honey, Coal Black and the Seven Dwarves, Goldilocks and the Jivin' Bears, Tokyo Jokyo, and Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips, when an organization that made those things has the upper hand on Mormonism when it comes to race issues, there's something deeply and cynically wrong with this thing that we consider a church. Now, I'm sure Warner Brothers made like lots of money off of those racist cartoons when those cartoons were popular. So those disclaimers in front of those cartoons now, I'm sure that doesn't, hurt the royalty checks anymore. I digress. Chapter 3 of the Book of Abraham is where things actually get really interesting. While he worked on the Book of Abraham, Joe was studying Hebrew, reading the Jewish historian Josephus, and also reading a book by Thomas Dick on philosophy and astronomy. Joe just couldn't resist the opportunity to show off all of his worldly knowledge in the Book of Abraham. Check this out. Quote, "And I, Abraham, had the Urim and Thummim, which the Lord my God had given unto me in Ur of the Chaldees. And I saw the stars, also that they were very great, and that one of them was nearest unto the throne of God. And there were many great ones which were near unto it. And the Lord said unto me, These are the governing ones, and the name of the great one is Kolob, because it is near unto me. For I am the Lord thy God. I have set this one to govern all those which belong to the same order of that upon which thou standest. And the Lord God said unto me by the Urim and Thummim, that Kolob was after the manner of the Lord, according to its times and seasons in the revolutions thereof. That one revolution was a day unto the Lord, after his manner of reckoning, it being 1,000 years, according to the time appointed unto that whereon thou standest. This is the reckoning of the Lord's time, according to the reckoning of Kolob." End quote. A few things to discuss from that passage. Abraham looks into his peepstone, just like Joe did, and he sees that God lives on a planet nearest the star named Kolob, apparently the brightest star in the night sky. And that planet revolves around its sun so slowly that it takes 1,000 Earth years to make a single revolution. Although, to God, this apparently only feels like one day. Now, astronomy wasn't actually Joe's strong suit, but he knew just enough to feel supremely confident in writing scriptures about it. If Joe was anything, he was a walking Dunning-Kruger effect. There's a lot of gobbledygook in the Book of Abraham, so I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but the gist of it is that there's a hierarchy of celestial bodies in the universe, and as you move up that hierarchy, the celestial bodies become more luminous and time slows down. Time is slower on the moon than it is on the earth, and slower on the sun than it is on the moon, and so forth up the hierarchy of celestial bodies until you come to Kolob, which has the slowest time of all, and it governs the entire visible universe that we can see when we look up at the stars at night. Now, this should make Kolob pretty easy to identify by modern astronomers, one would think, because it's supposed to be the brightest star. Well, Kolob also has two companion stars that together basically comprise a celestial first presidency. Then there are 12 moving stars like a celestial quorum of 12 apostles, and 12 fixed stars in a celestial high council. The whole universe, just read the Book of Abraham chapter 3. It's really fascinating if you're reading it through a naturalistic lens and trying to understand Joe's astronomy here. Astrology. Sorry, this is definitely astrology, my mistake. So anyway, the whole universe is structured basically like the presidency of his church. And the primacy of Kolob over the universe is cosmic evidence of the primacy of Joseph Smith over the church. Not only did this egomaniac write himself into the Book of Mormon and the Bible as prophesied even by name, Joseph, son of Joseph, but he also wrote himself into the literal stars through the Book of Abraham. But another thing here that absolutely cannot escape our skeptical eye is the term Kolob itself. From where did Joe get this unique and odd term? He probably picked it up during his first round of Hebrew studies, after the Egyptian papyri were purchased in Kirtland. Now, Hebrew is an efficient language of consonants, meaning that translators are responsible for putting in the vowels they best estimate to match the meaning of the original author. That means kolob in Hebrew would be just KLB, which translates to dog. This has led Mormons to speculate that Kolob is actually Sirius, or Alpha Canis Majoris, also called the Dog Star, as it's the brightest star in the night sky. You can see Sirius, Kolob, in the night sky by tracing the 3 stars of Orion's belt that form a line to the nose of Canis Majoris, the dog star. So from that passage in the Book of Abraham claiming that Kolob is the brightest star was just Joe using the Hebrew word for Canis Majoris and saying, yeah, God lives there, while pointing to the brightest star in the sky. However, where I find this to be really interesting is where the term KLB, or dog, comes up in the Bible, from which Joseph Smith would have been studying it. In the Bible, dogs are always defiled and they're dirty creatures. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 18, we find where dogs are held in regard as low as prostitutes, from the King James Version of the Bible. Quote, "Thou shalt not bring the hire of a whore or the price of a dog into the house of the Lord thy God for any vow," meaning tithings. "For even both these are abomination unto the Lord thy God." End quote. Basically, if you're making money offering to God as tithing, you better not make your money by being a sex worker or give him the price that a dog costs. That doesn't seem quite right to me. So why don't we look at the New International Translation of the same verse to see if KLB can take on a different meaning. Quote, "You must not bring the earnings of a female prostitute or of a male prostitute into the house of the Lord your God to pay any vow, because the Lord your God detests them both." End quote. When the Book of Abraham was published, and the passage that we read earlier was actually fleshed out, polygamy was being openly practiced among the closest acolytes of the prophet, and he'd soon write the revelation, less than a year later, that only men who ascend to become gods are those with multiple wives. Yes, Joseph Smith said that God grew up on a planet nearest the star Gigolo, I guess. Not only does God have probably millions of wives that we don't talk about because we may or may not have the same heavenly mother from this one dude, but God grew up on a planet ruled by the star male sex worker. Sirius. That's it. Did Joe just get us all? Like, was that deliberate? Did he mean to do that? Is that just a little signal that he hid in the Book of Abraham? The word kolob had to come from somewhere in his brain. Like, did he just send a signal to everybody in the future who would study him? Was one of the mysteries of his kingdom that only those with spiritual eyes could see, that God grew up on the planet male sex worker, gigolo? If so, like, that is bold-faced egotism if I ever did see it in all my days studying this hubris-filled narcissist. Moving on, after moving to Missouri, one project that Joe worked on there in 1838 was an official history of his life. Moses had the Book of Moses, Abraham had the Book of Abraham, Nephi had the Book of Nephi. This was Joe Smith's Book of Joe Smith. He used it to construct an epic legend of his life and to smooth over some rough spots in his personal autobiography. And when I say smooth over some rough spots, I mean he totally revised and fabricated facts about his life, and apologists have been shouldered with the unenviable task of harmonizing all of those plot holes ever since. I can think of no greater example of historical revisionism than Joseph Smith's first vision account. From his first iteration in 1832 to this official 1839 version that's canonized as Mormon scripture in the Pearl of Great Price, dozens of important and foundational claims are wildly different and take place at different times in his life. And the first vision serves to be a catalyst for many people losing their faith in the church. Episodes 19, 24, 32, and 33. Joe had written his first account of the first vision in 1832 by his own hand. According to this account, he felt convicted of his sins, and he couldn't find a church that matched the one that he had read about in the New Testament, so he prayed and, quote-unquote, the Lord appeared and forgave him of his sins. This 1832 story was already an evolution from the first dictated account written by Ollie, Counting All Over, which became Book of Commandments, Chapter 24, or Modern Day Doctrine and Covenants, Section 20. This is what it says, quote, "For after it was truly manifested unto this first elder, Joseph Smith, that he had received a remission of his sins, he was entangled again in the vanities of the world. But after truly repenting, God ministered unto him by an holy angel, whose countenance was as lightning, and whose garments were pure and white above all whiteness," supremely white, one might say, "and gave unto him commandments which inspired him from on high, and gave unto him power by the means which were before prepared that he should translate a book." End quote. So in the Book of Commandments 24, or Modern Doctrine and Covenants Section 20, the first dictated version of his first vision experience, there's absolutely nothing in there about God or Jesus appearing to him. Just says that God ministered to Joe through a supremely white angel who is unnamed and doesn't determine whether it was a resurrected being or if it was a spirit, an angel. Joe wouldn't come up with the little handshake litmus test for true or familiar spirits for another few years. Now, this is actually the first dictated version of the first vision, but it wasn't actually published until 1833 in the Book of Commandments, making his own 1832 account generally agreed to be the first vision account. But even from this 1830 dictation of his revelation, Book of Commandments, chapter 24, to the 1832 version that he wrote by his own hand, we see legendary evolution to serve a false narrative of divine sanction when no such thing ever actually happened. He wrote in his second account in 1835, just 3 years after his first 1832 version. In the 1835 version, it wasn't his sins that bothered him so much, it was that he couldn't decide which church was true. So he went to the woods and prayed about it. But he encountered some kind of demonic opposition that swelled his tongue in his mouth so that he couldn't speak, and then he heard footsteps approaching from behind him. Cottonmouth is an annoying side effect that some of us are all too familiar with. On his third attempt to pray in this 1835 account, he finally broke free of this demonic influence and called out in mighty prayer, and then a pillar of fire appeared above him, and a quote-unquote personage told him that his sins were forgiven and that Jesus is the Son of God. He also saw many angels. The 1832 account hadn't mentioned the demonic attack, the pillar of fire, or the angels, it just said God. But in the 1835 version, it says a personage. And finally, in 1838, he gave the version that became his official history. This 1838 version that wasn't published until 1842 starts out the same way as the 1835 account. He was trying to figure out which church was true, so he went out into the woods, and then he prayed, and then his tongue swelled in his mouth. But instead of hearing footsteps behind him, in this 1838 version, he saw darkness all around him. He had this breakthrough moment, and then he saw a pillar of light, not a pillar of fire. But in this version, there were two personages in the light rather than just one, and, quote, "One of them spake unto me, calling me by name, and said, pointing to the other, This is my beloved Son, hear him." Joe asked that personage which of the churches are true, and, quote, "I was answered that I must join none of them, for they are all wrong." And the personage who addressed me said that all their creeds were an abomination in his sight, and that those professors were all corrupt, that they draw near to me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. He just lifted that straight out of the Bible. They teach for doctrines the commandments of men, having a form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. End quote. Boy, God and Jesus sure have a lot to say in this latest 1838 version that Joe just apparently neglected to mention in the 1832 and the 1835 versions, as well as the 1833 version that became the Doctrine and Covenants section 20. And hang on, also, God and Jesus Why do we suddenly have two personages when in the previous versions it just said one? Jesus was there with his dad, and you just forgot to mention that in the previous versions? And where did the pantheon of angels go? With these few conflicting details about the nature of God, I'm only just barely scratching the surface of the historical revisionism that Joe does in his official history. The details of his vision of Moroni change as well. In some versions, he gives the angel's name as Nephi, not Moroni. Joe, the angel told you his name, and you can't keep it straight? Was it Nephi or was it Moroni? In the span of 7 years in New York and Kirtland, Joe not only changed the very words of God in his Book of Mormon, in his Doctrine and Covenants, in the Bible, but he even changed the very nature of God from a single personage in the sky to legions of angels, to God again, and then to God and Jesus in corporeal form, and then ended up forgetting the name of the angel who appeared to him, who happened to be an integral character in the Book of Mormon narrative, and functions to tell us how the plates got buried in New York in the first place for Joe to even translate to begin with. Do you think that George R.R. Martin ever mixes up Ned Stark with Jon Snow in his interviews? Oh, it was never Joseph Smith himself who made that mistake. It was the author of the Evening and the Morning Star article. Okay, well, that's Ollie. That's Oliver Cowdery. Do you think George R.R. Martin's writing assistant ever mixes up Ned Stark and Jon Snow? All of these inconsistencies wouldn't be a problem if Joe's latest story wasn't canonized scripture, because scripture is supposed to be God's word and therefore perfect. But it is. And now we have M. Russell Ballard standing up in General Conference offering low-rent pseudo-apologetics about his great-great-great-uncle by claiming that we are blessed to have at least 4 different accounts of the first vision. Replete throughout this era of the history of the church, we find Joe and his closest acolytes preaching about his history and how the Book of Mormon came to be. The propaganda campaign started early, and the very survival of the church relied on people believing Joe's lie. But thus we see, you lie for long enough to enough people, and they'll call it their sincerely held religious belief. To fabricate a story, alter it to serve selfish ends, then canonize it as scripture, meaning the holy word of God, then to convince legions of foot soldiers to spread those lies, is an act of narcissistic self-importance that would cause Eli Bosnick to blush, and he is utterly shameless. Sure, you were a 9/11 truther at one point, but has anybody actually verified Eli's history? Has anybody compared his different tellings of when he first met No Illusions? It just beggars belief, that's all I'm saying. Moving on. We've already talked quite a bit about Joe's midnight flight from Kirtland, Ohio to Far West, Missouri, beginning in December of 1837, and his role starting a war against the Missourians throughout the entire year of 1838. So, if you've listened to the rest of this series, or episodes 39 through 50, then you already know that the Mormons had an agreement to stay in Caldwell County, where Far West was. But when Joe showed up, he decided that God wanted the Saints to expand into Daviess County and establish the settlement of Adam-on-Diamond there. This would become a Twin City Mormon headquarters to complement Far West in Caldwell County, thus expanding the tactical advantages in the coming Missouri Mormon War. What I haven't talked about yet is where Adam-on-Diamond actually comes from. On May 19th, 1838, Joe visited the area where he wanted to put a new settlement. Lyman White had already built a house there, and according to the history of the church, quote, "We pursued our course up the river, mostly through timber, for about 18 miles, when we arrived at Colonel Lyman White's house. He lives at the foot of a Tower Hill, a name I gave the place in consequence of the remains of an old Nephite altar or tower that stood there, where we camped for the Sabbath. In the afternoon, I went up the river about half a mile to White's Ferry, accompanied by President Sidney Rigdon and my clerk, George W. Robinson, for the purpose of selecting and laying claim to a city plat near said ferry in Daviess County, Township 60, ranges 27 and 28, and sections 25, 36, 31, and 30, which the brethren called Spring Hill. But by the mouth of the Lord it was named Adam-on-Diamond, because, said he, God, it is the place where Adam shall come to visit his people, or the Ancient of Days shall sit as spoken of by Daniel the prophet, end quote. Now, this bit about this being the place where Adam will come to sit in judgment in the last days, that is canonized in LDS Scripture as Doctrine and Covenants section 116, but there's a lot more. Not only was this a Book of Mormon location with an old Nephite altar, apparently, not only was it the place where Adam would return in the last days, but it was also the place where Adam and Eve offered sacrifices after they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. According to Heber Kimball, on pages 209 to 210 of The Life of Heber C. Kimball, his autobiography, quote, "The prophet Joseph called upon Brother Brigham, myself, and others, saying, 'Brethren, come, go along with me, and I will show you something.' He led us a short distance to a place where the ruins of 3 altars built of stone, one above the other, and one standing a little back of the other, like unto the pulpits of the Kirtland Temple, representing the order of 3 grades of priesthood. 'There,' said Joseph, 'is the place where Adam offered up sacrifice after he was cast out of the garden. The altar stood at the highest point of the bluff. I went and examined the place several times while I remained there.'" End quote. Listen, Joe wanted to put a settlement here, but he knew that his people had made an agreement not to expand out of Caldwell County, and this was in Daviess County. So he had to give them really good reasons to feel like this land belonged to them in order to justify violating the agreement that they had with the Missourians. So he came up with the stories about the Nephites and the altars there and Adam and Eve having lived there and offering sacrifices there after they were cast out of the Garden of Eden. Once again, you're making stuff up again, Joseph, right? He did this all the time, on the spot, to serve short-sighted ends. And those lies have forced over a century and a half of apologists to try to harmonize and figure out exactly how the Garden of Eden was in Jackson County, Missouri, while all the descendants of Adam and Eve were Israelites in the Middle East. Some apologists will say that everything in the Bible before the flood actually happened in America, and Noah's Ark was built here only to convey Noah to Mount Ararat when the flood receded, and basically God hit the reset button for all life on earth. Or maybe once they left the Garden of Eden, they wandered across the Atlantic Ocean all the way to modern-day Jerusalem before they had Cain and Abel. Maybe the spaceship that brought Jehovah, Peter, James, and John here just happened to pick up Adam and Eve and plop them down in northern Africa as a courtesy. I suppose pesky little facts like the Bible narrative itself don't much matter when you're just making up your own facts in your own narrative within your own militant Christian cult the way that Joe did. The fact of the matter is, Joe didn't think that he had to abide by any agreements with the Missourians because he thought that he was invincible and therefore could justify expanding into Daviess County away from Caldwell. Here's an excerpt from a sermon that he gave during the Missouri-Mormon War that resulted from his decision to expand into Daviess County. This is from the History of Reed Peck. Quote, "We have yielded to the mob in DeWitt, and now they are preparing to strike a blow in Daviess. But I am determined that we will not give another foot, and I care not how many come against us, 10 or 10,000. God will send his angels to our deliverance, and we can conquer 10,000 as easily as 10. End quote. Joe clearly had delusions of single-handedly fighting off entire armies with nothing but his God power-infused fisticuffs. Obviously, no angels showed up, though, and Joe got a wake-up call when thousands of state militiamen surrounded Far West and Adam-on-Diamond ready to exterminate every single Mormon. Fortunately for Joe's followers, Joe came to his senses, and he realized that he couldn't win this fight through sheer force of his own ego, and he ordered his troops to lay down their arms and surrendered the town of Far West, and immediately sent a messenger to Adam-on-Diamond instructing the leadership there to do the same. A military leader worth his salt doesn't buckle before his shot is fired in an actual battle. Joe was a poser, and his entire public persona required that he never break that prideful facade. In Illinois, Joe had a couple of encounters that reminded him of Michael Chandler showing up in Kirtland with the Egyptian papyri and the mummies, and he tried to duplicate his earlier success with the Book of Abraham. Unfortunately for Joe, Both of these encounters were hoaxes. They were designed to expose him for the fraud that he was, and in his arrogance, he fell for both of these hoaxes. In the first case, a contemporary critic of Joseph Smith named Henry Caswell picked up a copy of the March 1842 Times and Seasons in which was printed the Book of Abraham and the facsimiles from which the Book of Abraham was supposedly translated. Henry Caswell, a professor and reverend, donned regular street clothes and embarked upon a journey to Nauvoo to visit the prophet. Caswell had on his person a copy of a Greek Psalter, or in other words, a manuscript of the book of Psalms from the Bible that was written in Greek. The one Caswell had with him, he estimated to be from the 1200s of the Common Era. The day that Caswell arrived in Nauvoo, he toured the city. At Newell K. Whitney's store, he, quote, mentioned that I had been informed that Mr. Smith possessed some remarkable Egyptian curiosities, which I wished to see. I added that if Mr. Smith could be induced to show me his treasures, I would show him in return a very wonderful book which had lately come into my possession, referring to the Greek Psalter, of course. So he showed that worm-eaten book to the storekeeper and a group of spectators there, one of whom, quote, declared that he knew it to be a revelation from the Lord, and that probably it was one of the lost books of the Bible providentially recovered. Looking at me with a patronizing air, he assured me that I had brought it to the right place to get it interpreted, for that none on earth but the Lord's prophet, Joseph Smith, could explain it or unfold its real antiquity and value, end quote. So the storekeeper, Newell K. Whitney, agreed to set up a meeting between Henry Caswell and Joseph Smith. When Caswell met Joe, a crowd gathered, clamoring to see this Greek Psalter, this book that he'd brought with him. From Caswell's account, quote, I met Joseph Smith at a short distance from his dwelling, and was regularly introduced to him by the storekeeper. On entering the house, chairs were provided for the prophet and myself, while the curious and gaping spectators remained standing. I handed the book to the prophet, and begged him to explain its contents, that's the Greek Psalter. He asked me if I had any idea of its meaning. I replied that I believed it to be a Greek Psalter, but that I should like to hear his opinion. And I will point out, just a brief side note here, this is one of the few cases where we actually get to see Joe's actual grammar, the way that he really talked, because everything, all of his sermons and everything are modernized. But this is just one of those brief instances where we can see a window into how Joseph Smith actually spoke. Here we go. No, he said, it ain't Greek at all, except perhaps a few words. What ain't Greek is Egyptian, and what ain't Egyptian is Greek. This book is very valuable. It is a dictionary of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Pointing to the capital letters at the commencement of each verse, he then said, them figures is Egyptian hieroglyphics, and them which follows is the interpretation of the hieroglyphics written in the Reformed Egyptian. Them characters is like the letters that was engraved on the golden plates. End quote. So, seeing this Greek Psalter presented to him, Joe offered to buy the book from Caswell, which was, it really wasn't worth much to Caswell since, he couldn't read it, of course. Caswell declined and said that the book was worth many $100s. He also declined to lend the book to Joe for him to apparently translate. Caswell then wrapped up the book and then asked Joe to show him the Egyptian papyrus. Continuing from Caswell, quote, he, meaning Joseph, produced the glass frames which I had seen on the previous day, but he did not appear very forward to explain the figures. I pointed to a particular hieroglyphic and requested him to expound its meaning. No answer being returned, I looked up, and behold, the prophet had disappeared. The Mormons told me he had just stepped out and would probably soon return. It's like it's straight out of a terrible sitcom, right? Hey, Joe, what does this mean? Wait, where did he go? Where'd the prophet go? The Mormons told me he just stepped out and will probably soon return. I waited some time, but in vain, and at length descended to the street in front of the store. Here I heard the noise of wheels, and presently I saw the prophet in a light wagon, flourishing his whip and driving away as fast as 2 fine horses could draw him. As he disappeared from my view, enveloped in a cloud of dust, I felt that I had turned over another page in the great book of human nature. End quote. That's a contemporary account. And I think we all get that sense, turn over another page in the great book of human nature. I think we all get that sense occasionally when we study the life of Joseph Smith. After Caswell's interaction with Joe, and Joe quickly fleeing the scene of his own stupidity, Caswell approached Willard Richards about the scenario, to which Whiteout Willard said, quote, "Sometimes Mr. Smith speaks as a prophet and sometimes as a mere man," end quote. This story highlights Joe's arrogance and the ability of his friends to cover for his lies and shortcomings. It didn't matter the subject. Joe always had to be the most knowledgeable in the room about it. Then, when he was clearly lying and caught up in a lie, people like Whiteout Willard Richards were there to equivocate and to excuse the behavior. Millions have fallen into line behind these lies to protect the precious name of a conceited man whose only ability where he excelled was habitually lying. The second hoax happened the following year in 1843. It was perpetrated by a man named Wilbur Fugit and his two friends, Robert Wiley and Bridge Whitten. These guys were three jolly gents living in a town near Nauvoo called Kinderhook, Illinois, right near Quincy, where the Saints first settled after the Missouri Exodus in early 1839. And similar to Henry Caswell with the Greek Psalter, these guys devised a plan to lure Joe into a trap to make him look like a fool. However, these three weren't satisfied with presenting a simple Greek Psalter to the self-proclaimed prophet and translator and seeing what happened. They took it to the next level. Wilbur Fugit had some level of metallurgical expertise. He, along with Wiley and Whitten, made a set of 6 little plates and used some chemicals to etch them, giving them a kind of a patina, making them look, ancient to untrained eyes. On April 16th, 1843, they put their plan into play. They claimed to have found the plates in an Indian burial mound near Kinderhook, along with the skeleton of a 9-foot-tall giant. Of course, two things that would be incredibly appealing to the proclaimed prophet of God who wrote the history of the Nephites and Lamanites. Then they took those plates to Nauvoo to show them to this almighty prophet who could translate unknown languages. And in his journal from May 7th, 1843, Joe recorded, quote, "In the forenoon, I was visited by several gentlemen concerning the plates which were dug out of a mound near Kinderhook, sent by William Smith, Joe's younger brother, to the office for Hebrew Bible and Lexicon," end quote. An anonymous letter published in the New York Herald says, quote, "The plates are evidently brass and are covered on both sides with hieroglyphics. He compared them in my presence with his Egyptian alphabet, which he took from the plates from which the Book of Mormon was translated, and they are evidently the same characters. He therefore will be able to decipher them," end quote. And immediately during this time, the Times and Seasons, the Mormons propaganda machine, reported, quote, "President Joseph has translated a portion and says they contain the history of the person with whom they were found. And he was a descendant of Ham through the loins of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and that he received his kingdom through the ruler of heaven and earth." Now, how a descendant of Ham, the Pharaoh and king of Egypt, ended up somewhere in, BF Illinois, buried with his little metal plates, and he happened to be a 9-foot-tall giant. Who knows? Those are facts, and those are things that happen in reality that we don't really want to deal with because this is religion, and religion doesn't have to deal with reality. But this was all a trap, and Joe got suckered by this hoax, and then he offered a preliminary interpretation of these Kinderhook plates. Now, the apologists are going to point out that he apparently used a Hebrew lexicon and the Egyptian alphabet and grammar in order to find out what was the content of these plates. So he was translating by secular means rather than by divine revelation. So he was translating by the power of man instead of by the gift and power of God. Therefore, he may have mistranslated them. But that just pushes the problem back a step, because where did the Egyptian grammar and alphabet come from? By revelation in 1835, when the papyri were first acquired from Michael Chandler. That's when Joseph Smith wrote the Egyptian alphabet and grammar. We have those documents. We have those notebooks. We know what they say. We have his own scribes writing down his translation of the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and he was apparently using that that lexicon that he devised in Kirtland from the Egyptian papyri that he bought in order to decipher the Kinderhook plates. The reality is that either Joe could translate unknown languages or he couldn't. He said he could do it, and he was wrong. At best, he perceived himself with delusions of grandeur. At worst, it was yet another lie to keep his people interested and invested in new developments in the cult with a living and an expanding doctrine and theology. And what I find even more fascinating about this story is that the hoaxers didn't reveal the fraud because they were waiting for Joe to produce a translation of the Kinderhook plates. And he never actually got around to producing that translation, to authoring that translation before he died. If the Mormons had pushed him to actually produce the translation like they did with the Book of Abraham from the Egyptian papyri, there's no telling what it might actually have contained. And the resulting scripture, just like the Book of Abraham, it probably would have been canonized as part of the Pearl of Great Price. Finally, in 1879, more than 35 years after Joseph Smith died, Wilbur Fugit finally appeared back on the scene with an affidavit that he had colluded with the two other guys to fabricate the Kinderhook plates and explained exactly how they did it with the metallurgical process. The great thing is about Wilbur Fugit finally coming forward in 1879, is that apologists didn't believe him. They attacked his character, and they continued to insist that the Kinderhook plates were authentic until 1980. 1980! A lie that perpetuated for almost 140 years. A chemical analysis was finally done on the Kinderhook plates, and the Ensign itself, the church's own periodical, admitted the plates were a forgery in 1981. So much for Joe's gift of translation by the gift and power of God, and so much for the credibility of Mormon apologetic thinkers, if they can be called thinkers, like Hugh Nibley and his cabal of sophists. That's all episode 143. Now, despite his, flirtation with the Greek Psalter and with the Kinderhook plates in Illinois, Joe wrote fewer scriptures there than he had earlier in his life. Instead, he mostly couched new doctrines in his sermons and his temple rituals to smaller and smaller groups of people that he knew that he could trust. At the October 1841 General Conference, Joe delivered a sermon in which he introduced the doctrine of baptisms for the dead. Joe considered Mormon baptism to be a requirement for exaltation, so that raised the problem of what happens to loved ones who have died without the opportunity for Mormon baptism, like Joe's older brother, Alvin. Baptism for the dead solved that problem by allowing a living person to be baptized for and in behalf of a deceased person. The person who stands proxy becomes a savior for their dead loved one. Here are some quotes from the record of this sermon in the history of the church. Quote, "He, Joseph, presented baptism for the dead as the only way that men can appear as saviors on Mount Zion. There is a way to release the spirit of the dead, that is, by the power and authority of the priesthood, by binding and loosing on earth. This doctrine appears glorious, inasmuch as it exhibits the greatness of divine compassion and benevolence in the extent of the plan of human salvation." End quote. So this gives you an idea of the direction of Joe's theology, the direction that it's going. Humans can be saviors. We have the power and authority of the priesthood to make decrees here on earth that God is obligated to follow in heaven. Our covenants, our ordinances. This is a very human-centered theology. And I forget, why do other Christians consider Mormons to be antichrist? There was, however, a catch after Joe had introduced the doctrine of baptisms for the dead, because he recognized that it could be leveraged as a tool to make the Mormons work harder on his own pet projects. Quote, President Joseph Smith then announced, "There shall be no more baptisms for the dead until the ordinances can be attended to in the font of the Lord's house, and the church shall not hold another general conference until they can meet in said house, for thus saith the Lord." End quote. His parting words are crucial to understanding why baptisms for the dead was used as leverage. He said, we must perform baptisms for the dead to get our own salvation, to become saviors, and to provide proxy salvation. But those baptisms, which had been done in the Mississippi River prior to this point, could now only be performed in the house of the Lord, the temple, Talos' crown. No more necromancy for the Mormons until they finish building the temple. No more salvation for the Mormons, and no more general conferences, when he broke that promise, until a great and spacious building finished construction. And then he capped off this coercive screed with a "Thus saith the Lord," to really drive the point home that he wasn't speaking as a man when he was leveraging the salvation, the exaltation, the saviorhood of the Mormons. This is how Joe motivated people to do what he wanted, by holding their dead relatives and their own celestial progress hostage. But no. Joseph Smith was a prophet of the restoration because it was what the Lord wanted for his people in this dispensation. It was all part of God's plan. It had absolutely nothing to do with Joe's own ego. In Nauvoo, Joe also introduced his temple rituals. But before we get to that, we need to discuss Mormonism and Freemasonry, because Freemasonry is essential context for understanding Joe's temple rituals. Episode 100. Freemasonry, for the basic 101 here, Freemasonry is a fraternal secret society, basically a club for dudes that involves various myths and rituals and oaths of loyalty and secrecy. It was first created probably in about the 14th century, although it claims to date all the way back to the time of the biblical King Solomon and the construction of Solomon's temple. The first official American Masonic Lodge was formed in 1731 in Pennsylvania. Many of the Founding Fathers were Masons, as were a number of the Enlightenment philosophers from whom the Founding Fathers drew their inspiration. Many politicians since the founding of this country have been Masons, or have had friends who are Masons. Masonic lodges are a great place to meet people and to share ideas and to share viewpoints that a person otherwise might not be exposed to. It's also a place to pass around the mysteries of the universe in its many forms. Masonry is the school, while fields of esoteric knowledge are basically the curricula taught in the school. Joseph Smith's father and two of his uncles were Universalists and Masons, with uncles Asel Smith, John Smith, and father Joseph Smith Sr. being so wrapped up in Masonry and Universalism and the occult. Joseph was literally surrounded by Masons during his most formative years as a child and teenager. Even Hiram, Joe's older brother, became a Mason in New York in the 1820s and spelled his name Hiram instead of Hyrum until pretty late in his life, which is an homage to the central figure of the Masonic passion narrative. That's why we call him Hiram Sidekick Abiff Smith. Then something extremely prominent and public occurred in Joe's own backyard. A guy named William Morgan wrote an expose of Freemasonry in which he shared many of the organization's secrets. Some Masons allegedly kidnapped him and then probably murdered him in retaliation. There was a huge wave of anti-Masonic sentiment in Joe's own neighborhood, and even the formation of an anti-Masonic political party that enjoyed some success in the next few elections. Lots of Masonic lodges, as a result of all of this, shut down, and the conspiracy theories that spread about Masonry still reverberate in our popular culture to this day as a result of the William Morgan affair. And then Joe ended up marrying William Morgan's widow in 1838, Lucinda Pendleton Morgan, who herself was a public figure in the anti-Masonry movement and enjoyed some public notoriety for her speeches about Masonry. The Book of Mormon and the Book of Moses contain language that has been interpreted as anti-Masonic. For instance, the Book of Mormon condemns secret combinations, which was a favorite phrase of the anti-Masonic movement. And the Book of Moses describes an ancient conspiracy between Cain and Satan in which they covenanted to commit murder and get gain. Cain took the title Master Mahan, M-A-H-A-N, which evoked the Masonic title of Master Mason, M-A-S-O-N, because Joe was the OG Mormon who was so good with nicknames, right? However, for the rest of his career, Joe was very positive towards Masonry, so it's kind of tough to reconcile the Book of Mormon's anti-Masonry with Joe's interest in Masonry. D. Michael Quinn straight up denies that the Book of Mormon is anti-Masonic, but his is kind of a fringe view on this subject. Other historians think that Joe was part of a reformist movement within Masonry, that affirmed true Masonry while condemning what reformers called spurious Masonry. Whatever his reasons for writing anti-Masonic rhetoric into the Book of Mormon, Joe later used a lot of Masonic language and symbolism in Kirtland and Missouri, and even became a master Freemason himself in Nauvoo. For instance, Joe's Danite organization, preceded by the Brother of Gideon Society in Kirtland, his Danite organization in Missouri seems to have had many Masonic parallels. Historian Todd Compton writes this in his book Fire and Sword, quote, "Descriptions of Danite signs and countersigns often employed Masonic terminology. The Masonic ideal was that a Mason in danger would make a Masonic sign or speak a Masonic word or phrase, then fellow Masons would recognize this signal and come to his aid. The Danite signs and passwords served exactly the same functions and were used in this way during the election knockdown at Gallatin." We talked about that last episode. Given Smith's extensive interest in Masonry at Nauvoo, it is possible that Masonic aspects of Danitism are a pre-Nauvoo example of Smith's interest in the Masonic ritual. It should be remembered that Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris, wife of George W. Harris, a prominent member of the Far West High Council, was the widow of Masonic martyr William Morgan, who had published the first expose of the Masonic Rite. The Joseph Smith family stayed with the Harrises when they first arrived in Far West, end quote. In Illinois, Joe became close friends with John C. Bennett and Lucius Scoville, both Freemasons. In 1841, Scoville tried to get a lodge in Quincy, Illinois to sponsor the creation of a Masonic lodge in Nauvoo. The Quincy Lodge refused. Normally, you wouldn't be able to open a lodge without the sponsorship of another lodge, but the following year, on March 15, 1842, Illinois Grand Master Abraham Jonas waived that rule and granted Nauvoo a special dispensation, quote-unquote, to organize a lodge in Nauvoo. He also made Joseph Smith and his counselor, Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon, quote-unquote, Masons at sight. He probably did this on the promise that the Mormons would vote for him for public office. He raised Joe directly to the third or to the sublime degree of Master Mason and appointed Joe as Grand Chaplain of this new Nauvoo Lodge. Eventually, about 1,500 men joined the Nauvoo Lodge, compared to about 150 men per lodge in the rest of Illinois. Everything about the Nauvoo Lodge was irregular, and it infuriated Masons all over the rest of Illinois. By 1844, the number of Master Masons in Nauvoo, almost all of them Mormons, outnumbered the Masons in the rest of the state of Illinois. The obvious endgame with making so many Mormon men Masons was for political gains and elevating Nauvoo to national notoriety among other Masons throughout the nation. With the Nauvoo Lodge so massive, Joe became one of the most powerful Masons in the nation at the time, and he must have absolutely delighted in that fact. About 7 weeks after Joe received the Masonic mysteries, he introduced the Nauvoo Endowment Ceremony. Historian Fawn Brody argued on page 279 of her book, No Man Knows My History, quote, "The Mormon Temple Endowment Ceremony is, without a doubt, taken from the Masonic ceremonies Joseph Smith participated in just weeks before he introduced the Temple Endowment. The grips, tokens, covenants, secret words, keys, etc. were word for word the same when first introduced. Members who were Masons, previous to Joseph joining the fraternal order, unashamedly referred to the Mormon Endowment as Celestial Masonry." End quote. A contemporary account lends some insight into Joseph's mentality behind appropriating, basically stealing the Masonic rituals for the Temple Endowment Ceremony. In a letter from Heber the Creeper Kimball to P. Parley Parker Pratt, Kimball said the following, quote, "Brother Joseph says Masonry was taken from priesthood but has become degenerated, but many things are perfect," end quote. Now, I won't get into all the similarities between Masonry and Mormonism, the Mormon Endowment Ceremony, but here are just a few examples. The main symbols of Masonry are the compass and the square. A compass and a square are also cut into the Mormon temple garments. The handshakes are almost exactly the same as are the 5 points of fellowship. Masonic initiates are given a new name, and so are Mormon initiates. The Masonic ceremony included an oath of secrecy and a penalty sign where you drew your thumb across your throat to indicate what would happen to you if you spilled the fraternity's secrets, And the Mormon endowment used very similar oath and penalty signs and language. Now, I could go on, but the oath and the penalty here are maybe the most important part, because this is the piece of Masonry that Joe cared the most about. He once declared that the secret of Masonry is to keep a secret. He was trying to teach his followers to keep his secrets, especially polygamy and world domination. On the 4th of May, 1842, Joe, as the highest of priests and master of ceremonies, along with his brother Hiram, spelled Hyrum now, as opposed to earlier in his life, Hiram, who was probably serving as senior grand warden or some other similarly named position, gathered 9 fellow master masons: James Adams, Heber the Creeper Kimball, William Law, Willie Marks, the Judas and Brutus of 1844, George Miller, Whiteout Willard Richards, Father Newell K. Whitney, and Bloody Brigham Young. And they performed the first temple passion narrative, the first instance of the endowment ceremony. These 9 men, Joe and Hiram, initiated the first week of May 1842 what would come to be known as the Anointed Quorum, or the Holy Order, or the Holy Order of the Anointed. This quorum in 1842 was the most secretive and esoteric group Joe had ever created in his entire ministry. And the endowment ritual involved passing through several degrees. In the first and second degrees, the initiates were washed and they were anointed with oil, infused with plants, and given garments to wear throughout the rest of the ritual. In the third and fourth degrees, there was a reenactment of the creation of the world and of the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The fifth degree portrayed a Protestant minister conspiring with the devil to destroy Mormonism. The sixth degree included the oaths and penalties, where you would, gesture slitting your own throat with a thumb. And then the seventh degree, the initiates symbolically entered a room which represented the celestial kingdom, where they rested on the seventh day, where they were crowned king and queen, and they were taught Mormonism's deepest secrets, such as the doctrine of polygamy. Joe wins them over with the flattery of crowning these people kings and queens. Just a little bit of sugar to make the medicine go down a little easier. Episodes 108, 110, and 111. A year after Joe created the Holy Order and introduced the endowment ritual, Joe also created another ritual called the Second Anointing. The Second Anointing gives you guaranteed salvation, and it involves some foot washing of you and your spouse, and it's just another one of these weird and esoteric practices. So those with the Second Anointing will go to the highest level of the celestial kingdom and get their own planet to rule as kings and queens, as gods, unless they shed innocent blood. That's the only disqualifier. Killing an innocent person was and is the only thing which would bar these called and elected saints with their second anointing from the celestial kingdom. And luckily, the church leadership designates who is and isn't innocent. Now, a brief note on secrecy in general. When a person like Joseph Smith, with as much social clout as he carried, creates exclusive groups, it encourages competition among his followers to prove their worth to the prophet and thereby gain access to those exclusive groups. There's an inherent coercion that takes place here, and it also self-selects for only the most loyal people to surround the prophet at any given time. With enough years of these exclusive and secretive groups, and Joe is surrounded exclusively with people who will do whatever he says, no matter how insane or immoral. People wonder how Joe was able to get people to, coerce young girls into celestial marriage, or to assassinate people, or to keep the secret designs of the impending Mormon revolution, the Mormon war machine, Talos, and so many other illegal, immoral, and outright vile practices secret. How did he keep these people from squealing about these things? The only people who were given this knowledge aspired to be granted that information only after exhibiting unyielding loyalty to the prophet for years. In many ways, for a person like Joe, this was always his dream, to have a group of close followers who hung on his every word as if it came from God himself. It takes a dangerous combination of charisma and conceit to create this human phenomena. Joe was far from the first or last to accomplish this, but he is a spectacular example of how these psychological mechanisms play out. Exclusivity centered around a cult of personality, especially a religious personality, exalts the person who leads the group to be far greater than human, to the point that a person like Joseph Smith can do no wrong, and anything that he desires is not only the most important thing in the world, but is the very will of God. 1,000 hit pieces could be written about him, and nothing would shake the loyalty of these dedicated, brainwashed followers. Hashtag Joe 2020, am I right? Now, all of this temple stuff ultimately culminated in the doctrine of exaltation. So let's go ahead and discuss that, even though, we're kind of getting a little ahead of ourselves in our, our micro timeline that we're discussing today, but it fits thematically. In 1844, Joe gave a famous sermon called the King Follett Discourse, in which he laid this doctrine of exaltation out, episodes 193, 194, and 195. It's called the King Follett Discourse because it was delivered at the funeral of a guy named King Follett. After a lengthy and nonsensical introduction, listeners of this show have no idea what that's like, do you? Joe jumps right into it by introducing the idea that before the world was created, a plan was laid, quote, in the midst of the council of the eternal God of all other gods, end quote. Obviously, the idea that there's more than one God, that was pretty heretical to Protestant Christians. But this idea, this Council of Gods idea, had been brewing in Joe's head for quite a while, a number of years. During his Hebrew studies, he had picked up on the fact that the creation story in the Bible uses the plural form of the word God, gods. His Jewish Hebrew teacher had told him that it was like the royal we, but Joe didn't buy that interpretation of it. He thought the creation story was teaching polytheism. And eventually, Joe would adopt the term Elohim to refer to God, which is just the pluralized version of the Hebrew El, meaning God. El, singular, Elohim, many, pluralized. The Mormon God is literally just the pluralized form of a generic term used in Hebrew to refer to many different gods. And yes, Yahweh isn't the only God in the Bible. He's just a jealous war god that the Israelites really liked because they were bloodthirsty monsters who frequently committed genocide at Yahweh's command. But next, in the King Follett Discourse, Joe asks a rhetorical question. Quote, what kind of a being is God? End quote. He basically says this is the most important question that religion can answer, and I'm going to answer it for you, so you better all listen to me. If I fail, then it's my duty to renounce all pretensions to being a prophet. But if I succeed, quote, let every man and woman henceforth put their hand on their mouth and never say anything against the man of God again, end quote. In other words, if you find my teachings inspirational, then you should just shut up and never complain about any of the crimes that I commit or the fact that I'm raping your daughters. Then Joe lays out his key idea, quote, first, God himself, who sits enthroned in yonder heavens, is a man, like unto one of yourselves. That is the great secret. I thought it was 42. If the veil was rent today, and the great God who holds this world in its orbit and upholds all things by his power, if you were to see him today, you would see him in all the person, image, and very form as a man. For Adam was created in the very fashion and image of God. Adam received instruction, walked, talked, and conversed with him as one man talks and communes with another. End quote. Why do other Christians consider Mormonism antichrist again? Well, maybe it's stuff like this about their precious, eternal, incorporeal, modalistic trifecta thingy who birthed himself only to kill himself to save his creation from himself. Quote, I am going to tell you how God came to be God. We have imagined that God was God from all eternity. These are incomprehensible ideas to some, but they are the simple and first principles of the gospel, to know for a certainty the character of God, that we may converse with him as one man with another, and that God himself, the Father of us all, dwelt on an earth the same as Jesus Christ himself did, and I will show it from the Bible." End quote. So God has a human body because he was once just a mortal man, just like all of us, who lived on an earth just like ours, nearest the star Gigolo, I might add, and at some point God became God. And that's not all, because you can become a god too. Quote, "You have got to learn how to be gods yourselves, to be kings and priests to God, the same as all gods have done, by going from a small degree to another, from grace to grace, from exaltation to exaltation, until you are able to sit in glory, as doth those who sit enthroned in everlasting power. The Bible says they shall be heirs of God and joint heirs with Jesus Christ. What is it? To inherit the same glory, the same power, and the same exaltation, until you ascend the throne of eternal power, the same as those who are gone before. What did Jesus do? Why, I do the things I saw my Father do when worlds came rolling into existence. I saw my Father work out his kingdom with fear and trembling, and I must do the same. And when I get my kingdom, I shall present it to my Father, so that he obtains kingdom upon kingdom, and it will exalt his glory, so that Jesus treads in his tracks to inherit what God did before. It is plain beyond disputation, and you thus learn some of the first principles of the gospel, about which so much hath been said." End quote. So we are God's heirs, and we will inherit the same glory and power that he has. Now, Joe was not the first person to teach something like this. This idea of becoming gods goes way back in Jewish and Christian theology and Kabbalah. In fact, Joe may have learned about some of this from his Jewish friend Alexander Niebauer, episode 155. It wasn't a very popular idea in 19th century America, though. Most Protestants had a theology of humility, which minimized human power in order to exalt God's power by dichotomy. Joe goes the opposite direction and minimizes God's power to human in order to exalt human power. Joe goes on in this sermon to lay out a bunch more ideas that exalt the human, including the idea that our spirits are self-existent, immortal, uncreated, and co-equal with God. Our spirits have existed for all eternity, and God merely organized them through celestial procreation with his harem of wives. An astronomer says we're all stardust. A Mormon says we're all God ejaculate. Now, there's one more quote that we need to read from the King Follett Discourse, and this is from Joe's concluding paragraph. Quote, "I have intended my remarks to all, both rich and poor, bond and free, great and small. I have no enmity against any man. I love you all. I am your best friend, and if persons miss their mark, it is their own fault." So there's so many psychological dynamics that are going into this. "If I reprove a man and he hates me, he is a fool, for I love all men, especially these my brethren and sisters. I rejoice in bearing the testimony of my aged friends. You never knew my heart. No man knows my history. I cannot tell it. I shall never undertake it. If I had not experienced what I have, I should not have known it myself. I never did harm any man since I have been born in the world. My voice is always for peace. I cannot lie down until all my work is finished. I never think any evil nor anything to the harm of my fellow men. When I am called at the trump of the archangel and weighed in the balance, you will all know me then. God bless you all. Amen." End quote. I, Joseph Smith, am perfect, and I wouldn't harm a fly. I'm full of love, never think any evil, and my history is too vast and great to be encompassed in words. Well, last week's episode was all about Joe's wrath against his enemies, so you'll have to forgive me if I don't buy into Joe's boasting and outright lies here about what a great and peaceful and loving guy he supposedly was. Just a few weeks before this, he published a letter in the Times and Seasons titled "A Friendly Hint to Missouri," threatening the entire state as the first place that the Great Mormon Militia would begin its military campaign to burn across the nation and overthrow the government. Episode 185. Joe even sent a letter to a private Revolutionary War militia known as the Green Mountain Boys, asking for help with this military campaign. Episode 181. How Joe wrapped the King Follett discourse taps into something that we're going to get into at the end of today's episode. The question of why he is such a fascinating and enigmatic figure to study. No man knows his history, but yet millions are taught it and thousands try to truly understand it. Why? More on that later. Joe boasted a lot during the Nauvoo years of his ministry. For instance, on July 29, 1842, after once again successfully evading state's authorities who attempted to arrest him, Joe got up on the stand and preached a sermon. Here is his account from the sermon in the History of the Church, Volume 5. Quote, "I arose and congratulated the brethren and sisters on the victory I had once more gained over the Missourians. I had told them formerly about fighting the Missourians and about fighting alone. I had not fought them with the sword or by carnal weapons. I had done it by stratagem, by outwitting them. And there had been no lives lost, and there would be no lives lost if they would hearken to my counsel." Yeah, no lives lost. Yeah, that worked great for all the Mormons in Missouri, right? Especially the ones at Haun's Mill. "Up to this day, God had given me wisdom to save the people who took counsel. None had ever been killed who abode by my counsel." That is not true. At Haun's Mill, oh, well, he's going to address it directly. "At Haun's Mill, the brethren went contrary to my counsel. If they had not, their lives would have been spared." Oh, that's really great. If they just would have listened to you when you were in the process of surrendering, nobody would have been hurt. Nobody would have been shot. No kids would have been murdered by being shot in the head. No, none of that would have happened if you just would have listened to your incredible stratagem. Right, Joe? "I had been in Nauvoo all the while and outwitted Bennett's associates and attended to my own business in the city all the time. We want to whip the world mentally, and they will whip themselves physically. Orson Pratt had attempted to destroy himself and caused all the city almost to go in search of him. Orson Pratt and others of the same class caused trouble by telling stories to people who would betray me. And they must believe those stories because his wife told him so." Rest in peace, Sarah Pratt. You absolutely never deserved this. "I will live to trample on their ashes with the soles of my feet. If oppression comes, I will then show them that there is a Moses and a Joshua amongst us, and I will fight them. And if they don't take off oppression from me, I will do as I have done this time. I will run into the woods. I will fight them in my own way." End quote. I mean, the idea that he outwitted the Missourians during the 1838 Mormon War is pretty delusional, but the propaganda was so deeply ingrained into the collective mind of the Mormon mindset that they probably cheered when he said that. And the claim that no lives were lost except for the people at Haun's Mill, that's just inaccurate. The boasting about being a Joshua when he had escaped arrest by hiding in the woods, that's just kind of hilarious, isn't it? Yeah, Joe bravely fled into a corn patch. Yeah, real brave of you, buddy. And the part where he makes fun of Apostle Orson Pratt for having been driven to a suicide attempt by Joe's bad behavior? Seriously? And by the way, Orson Pratt, he was sitting on the stand when Joe said all of this and made an example of him. The whole crowd was looking at Pratt as Joe made fun of his thoughts of suicide and then called him a Judas and said that he would trample on his ashes. Frankly, it seems like Joe wanted Orson Pratt to commit suicide, and he was just trying to drive him to it. Maybe that would finally drive Sarah to the desperate ends of joining Joe's harem. Episodes 134 and 138. The people in the crowd fed off of this propaganda, off of these lies. Anybody sickened by how dishonest all of this was, had long since left the church. For everybody who remained, this was red meat to a bloodthirsty horde of rabid animals ready to goose step behind their revolutionary supreme leader. Here's another fun boasting of Joe's. This is December 29th, 1842. Joe was on his way to Springfield, Illinois, and he tried to stop for the night at a tavern in the town of Paris, Illinois, but the tavern owner said the people of Paris had heard that the Mormons were bad people and had made a compact not to shelter any Mormons in the town. Joe brags in History of the Church, Volume 5, about how he bullied the tavern keeper into letting him and his friends stay. Quote, "I said to him, 'We will stay, but no thanks to you. I have men enough to take the town, and if we must freeze, we will freeze by burning of these houses.' The taverns were then opened, and we were accommodated and received many apologies in the morning." End quote. Not only was the prophet the kind of person who would threaten to burn down your house to keep himself warm, but he was also the kind of person who thought that it was cool to brag about it in his own history after the Mormons had done that very thing not 5 years earlier. It was a loaded threat. It was a real threat. And here's another one. This is in 1843 when Joe sent his henchman, Joseph H. Jackson, to go murder Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs and to break Porter Rockwell out of prison after Port botched the assassination attempt. Jackson returned to Nauvoo, having failed both of those aspects of his mission. Episodes 144 and 147. Jackson went to Joe's house and, made some excuses, and then Joe prophesied that Pistol Pack and Porter would come home safely eventually. Then they had the following homoerotic conversation, as reported by Jackson. Quote, "Silence ensued for a few minutes, when Joe suddenly looked me full in the eye, and after gazing steadily for a few moments said, 'Jackson, you are the first man that I have ever met that I could not look down.' Said I, 'Do you like a bold eye?' He replied that he did, and then commenced a panegyric on himself. He said that he was a good and godly man, and that he had never known wrong in his life, for in all his acts he was guided and protected by the power of the Holy Ghost, that the Missourians had tried to kill him, but rifle balls could have no effect on him, for he had been shot at 13 times in Missouri, and the balls bounded back as hail from the side of a house. And for this reason he knew the Holy Ghost was with him, and that he truly was the greatest man on earth." End quote. According to Jackson, Joe considered himself literally invincible to gunshots, able to take every ball the Missourians could shoot at him without even flinching. In due time, we're going to put that claim to the test. In this conversation, Joe did some more bragging after his enforcers, known as the Destroying Angels, freed him from the custody of Sheriffs Harmon Wilson and Reynolds, who arrested him in June 1843 in Dixon, Illinois. The Destroying Angels took those sheriffs into custody while Joe was in their custody, and then added insult to injury by having them formally arrested for kidnapping by a Hancock County sheriff and forcing them to give up their guns that they used to arrest Joseph Smith. Then Joe made a triumphal entry into Nauvoo in full regalia, like some kind of bargain bin warlord. Episodes 144 and 145. A Nauvoo court held a habeas corpus hearing for Joe, in which Joe's lawyer made some completely asinine arguments, including the claim that the warrant was for Joseph Smith Jr., but Joe had a son by the same name and thus went by Joseph Smith Sr., and therefore couldn't be the same Joseph Smith named in the arrest warrant. No, they were trying to arrest his 10-year-old son, not him, of course. Episodes 146 and 147. That was actually one of his arguments. Joe went by Joseph Smith Jr. his entire life. He signed most of his letters with Joseph Smith Jr., and now he decides that he wants to be called Joseph Smith Sr. only when it was legally advantageous. The court ended up remanding Joe into the custody of the Nauvoo Marshal, Henry G. Sherwood, and of course, Sherwood let him go because he was a believing Mormon and a Danite. After this victory, Joe gave a sermon to brag about it with a bit more homoeroticism mixed into this scattered-brained rant. Quote, "I am well, I am hearty. I hardly know how to express my feelings. I feel strong as a giant. I pulled sticks with the men coming along, and I pulled up with one hand the strongest man that could be found. Then 2 men tried, but they could not pull me up. And I continued to pull mentally until I pulled Missouri to Nauvoo. But I will pass from that subject. Relative to our city charter, court's right of habeas corpus, I wish you to know and publish that we have all power." God mode Joe. And if any man from this time forth says anything to the contrary, cast it into his teeth. Punch him. That's what he's saying. Punch him. Get him out of here. I have dragged these men here by my hand, and I will do it again. But I swear I will not deal so mildly with them again. For the time has come when forbearance is no longer a virtue. And if you or I again are taken unlawfully, you are at liberty to give loose to blood and thunder. But before I will bear this unhallowed persecution any longer, before I will be dragged away again among my enemies for trial, I will spill the last drop of blood in my veins and will see all my enemies in hell. End quote. So Joe basically says, I'm the tug-of-war champion of the world, and I have beaten the whole state of Missouri at tug-of-war, and we are all powerful. Huzzah. And the next time that I beat them in a tug-of-war is going to be the last, because we're going to kill the bastards. Huzzah! It's classic Joe Smith. I can't wait to test that prophecy that he said at the end. And one of Joe's better boasts was on May 26th, 1844, when he knew that the publication of the Nauvoo Expositor was about to ignite a blaze throughout the city. This screed was aimed right at the Fosters, the Higbee's Laws, and Joseph Jackson. Now, if you log into the Utah Lighthouse Ministries website, this quote is featured on the front page to, I guess, prove how antichrist Joseph Smith was and to own the Mormons or something. I think this is funny, but like, this stuff is really important to religious folk and people who call themselves true Christians. And I will agree with those folks when they say that the modern church and Joseph Smith is everything contrary to the values in the Book of Mormon and Jesus' teachings. A few examples. Jesus was a socialist, and Mormonism today is the wealthiest religion in the world. Great and spacious buildings are unequivocally evil in the Book of Mormon, but Mormonism has 140-something temples, thousands of chapels, and owns all of the largest buildings in Utah. Jesus threw money changers out of the temple, but Mormons buy garments in their great and spacious temples. Jesus hung out with people who get excommunicated from the church today. Charity never faileth, yet the modern church gives less than 0.1% of their income to humanitarian aid. Don't pray in your closet. Pray before every meal, before every public gathering, with your family before bed and after waking up, and before every church function or scout or young women's camp like some kind of a nervous tick. Don't argue with the Pharisees. Invite them to a nice dinner after they arrive on your private jet, and then ask them to pass a bill or a tax cut for you. The Mormon Church has enough money to solve world hunger during a global pandemic, but that rainy day fund keeps growing as the government keeps shoveling money out to religions and corporations, leaving tens of millions of people unemployed without savings just to fend for themselves. My overall point is, claim whatever you want about your scriptures, but at least follow them to the extent that laws will allow it. You can't call the menu at Fat Shack your scriptures and then lobby government to pass laws forcing everybody to be vegetarian. You can't be a virgin Kama Sutra expert. You can't teach the pride cycle to millions of people while so clearly teetering on the edge before the fall. You don't get to preach racial tolerance and harmony while your God says that dark skin is a curse on the lazy and unrighteous fence-sitters in order to make them less appealing to his righteous white-skinned chosen people. What does it say about a person or an institution that so quickly discards its claimed words of God when they can make $1 doing so? Point made. Let's get to some of Joe's final words from late May 1844, just barely a month before he died in the Carthage gunfight. Quote, I have been in perils, and oftener than anyone in this generation. As Paul boasted, I have suffered more than Paul did. I should be like a fish out of water if I were out of persecution. Perhaps my brethren think it requires all this to keep me humble. The Lord has constituted me so curiously that I glory in persecution. I am not near so humble as if I was not persecuted. If oppression will make a wise man mad, much more a fool. If they want a beardless boy to whip all the world, I will get on top of a mountain and crow like a rooster. I shall always beat them. Come on, ye prosecutors, ye false swearers, all hell boil over, ye burning mountains roll down your lava, for I will come out on the top at last. I have more to boast of than ever any man had. I am the only man that ever has been able to keep a whole church together since the days of Adam. A large majority of the whole have stood by me. Neither Paul, John, Peter, nor Jesus ever did it. I boast that no man ever did such a work as me. The followers of Jesus ran away from him. The Latter-day Saints never ran away from me yet." End quote. Joe considered himself a greater man than Jesus Christ. And how can you argue with that? After all, Jesus wasn't able to keep a church together. He just hung out with marginalized people in society. Whereas Joe had kept an entire church together for 14 years with just, I don't know, maybe a major schism every 2 years or so, where some portion of the Latter-day Saints did indeed run away from him, or more accurately, chase him out of town at the point of a bayonet and pitchfork. But Joe's braggadocio isn't really the greatest sign of his arrogance. Boasting about, perceived accomplishments is one thing, but the greatest sign of his arrogance surrounds his greatest ambitions. He basically made plans to overthrow all national governments and take over the world, with himself at the head of his new world Mormon government, episode 214. Here's how Joseph Jackson explains Joe's plans while Joe was running for president of the United States in 1844. Quote, "There was a Mr. Brown, formerly of Rushville, with whom I became acquainted in Nauvoo soon after my arrival there. This man has a wonderful genius for invention and has planned a submarine battery and steam fire ship, which, to all appearance, is capable of great execution. He stated to me that he had been operating for 21 years in perfecting this work, but had not the means to bring the matter before the nation, and that Joe made him a proposition which had caused him to remove to Nauvoo. This proposition was to furnish the means to him, together with G.A. Adams and Orson Hyde, to Russia, where the invention would be laid before the emperor. And as Joe had great faith in its success, he expected a large sum for the secret, which Brown and Joe were to divide. This was palmed off on Brown, but was far from being Joe's real object. His real object was to build a tower in St. Petersburg. No, sorry, I messed that up. Joe's tower, a Smith tower. His real object, as he disclosed it to me, was this. He would first run for president, and thus be able to prove to the Emperor of Russia his strength in the Union. He would then send George A. Adams, Orson Hyde, and Brown to Russia, and after the utility of the invention had been fairly proved to the Emperor, Joe's proposition to him was to be submitted, which was to form a league for the overthrow of the powers that be. Now, this may seem too ridiculous for any man to imagine possible. Nevertheless, no one acquainted with the excessive vanity of Joe Smith will doubt but that he in reality believed that he could form even so preposterous a union." End quote. What is it with narcissistic presidential candidates looking to form alliances, looking for help from Russia? Why does that happen? Jackson's account of Joe's intentions is confirmed by the minutes of the Council of 50, which the LDS Church recently released as part of the Joseph Smith Papers Project. The Council of 50 was to be the Mormon government of the Kingdom of God under Joseph Smith as prophet, priest, king, and president of the United States. The minute book itself is titled Record of the Council of 50 or Kingdom of God. The official revealed name of the Council of 50 is the Kingdom of God and His Laws, with the keys and powers thereof, and judgment in the hands of His servants. Amen, Christ. End quote. Episodes 168, 169, and 170. Joe always wanted to be king of a world that looked to him as sole governmental and religious authority. He aspired to become a Moses, a Muhammad, a religious prophet warlord that subjugated the American people under his arm of power, only to then extend his military campaign to the rest of the world. The Council of 50 was how he planned on doing it. I can't stress enough how important the Council of 50 is. William Clayton, who kept the Council of 50 minute book, believed that the council replicated, quote, the grand council amongst the gods when the organization of this world was contemplated, end quote. Lyman White called it the Grand Council of God and Grand Council of Heaven. John D. Lee called it Councils of the Gods, which was fitting with Mormon theology because all these dudes believed that they were on the path towards godhood, towards becoming gods. And why wait for death for such a noble position? It was also sometimes called the Living Constitution because the authority of the living men who comprised the council trumped the authority of any dead document like the U.S. Constitution. From its infancy, Mormonism has been a revolutionary religion. That's not a badge of honor. It's a declaration of misanthropy and elitist lawlessness. Episode 214. Before the first meeting of the Council of 50 got underway on March 11th, 1844, Elder Lucian Woodworth moved that, quote, every member of it to be bound to eternal secrecy as to what passed here, not to have the privilege of telling anything which might be talked of to any person, even to our wives. And the man who broke the rule of secrecy should lose his cursed head. End quote. That motion passed unanimously. Then Joe laid out an agenda for the council, which included rewriting the U.S. Constitution, forming alliances with the Native Americans, and forming an alliance with Sam Houston in New Mexico, and attempting to form alliances with freed slaves. The agenda also included searching for a place out west for the Mormons to settle. Quote, all seemed agreed to look to some place where we can go and establish a theocracy. Establish a theocracy. Establish a theocracy. This was Joe's grand dream. In either Texas or Oregon or somewhere in California, etc. End quote. And that was just in the first meeting, episodes 185 and 189. A week later, on March 19th, 1844, Hyrum Smith made a speech in that council in which he said, quote, that the time was at hand when the prophecies should be fulfilled, when the nations were ready to embrace the gospel, and when the ensign should be lifted up and the standard to the people. And he believed if we will set up the standard and raise the ensign, the honest in heart of all nations will immediately begin to flock to the standard of our God. End quote. John Taylor got up next and said, quote, referred especially to the United States, England, Ireland, Scotland, France, Poland, Switzerland, Germany, all white countries, weird, etc., concerning the situation of the different nations of the earth, showing that they were ripe to receive the truth. At this meeting, the council, quote, resolved that a communication be made immediately to the general government through our representative, Mr. John Wentworth, specifying that General Joseph Smith will protect the Texas and Oregon from all foreign invasion if the general government will authorize him to raise volunteers in the United States for that purpose, end quote. Yeah, I'm sure their intentions in wanting to raise an army that ended up being 100,000 soldiers that Joe asked for was purely just for the defense of the United States. Just purely defensive, of course. At a later meeting on April 11th, 1844, quote, President Joseph was voted our prophet, priest, and king with loud hosannas. 2 days after that, Joe, quote, prophesied the entire overthrow of this nation in a few years, end quote. Where do apostates and non-believers exist in this Mormon theocracy? Are they allowed to even live? I'm reminded of like the 1,000-year of probation after the second coming, which is going to be the era where Jesus reigns supreme and every knee shall bow and every tongue confess the gospel is the way, the truth, and the light. How will billions of people be taught the gospel? Re-education prison camps, of course. That's the only way to do this logistically. Those who don't convert are given to the buffetings of Satan. Those people are the salt who hath lost its savor, to be cast out and trodden underfoot. You think a Mormon theocracy would be tolerant of any other religions or of non-religious folk like yours truly? Or would we be the Labans of the world? There were 3 non-Mormon members of the Council of 50. All of them are really interesting. Marion S. G. Eaton and Edward Bonney were both counterfeiters, as we discussed earlier in this series. Eaton specifically was a family friend of the Smiths from the New York era that, remained a member, one of the very few OG Mormons who remained a member throughout the entire history of the church. The third person was Uriah Brown. That was the guy who was the inventor described by Jackson, the guy who Jackson said had invented a submarine, and Jackson undersold that invention because Uriah Brown didn't just have plans to build a submarine, but also an invention of liquid fire to destroy an army or navy. Clearly, Joe wanted these flame-throwing submarines badly enough to let their non-Mormon inventor, Uriah Brown, sit on this highly secretive and revolutionary Council of 50. In the Council of 50 minutes recorded by William Clayton, or Quilliam Claypen as we call him, they were plutonium. And Joe knew it. If they fell into the hands of his enemies, he would be charged with high treason and immediately executed. When he gave himself up for arrest and he was taken to Carthage prior to the Carthage shootout, he whispered to Quilliam Claypen, quote, "and told me either to put the records of the kingdom into the hands of some faithful men and send them away, or burn them or bury them. I concluded to bury them, which I did immediately on my return home," end quote. 7 days after Joe was killed, Quilliam Claypen dug up the Council of 50 meeting minutes. They had been damaged by water, but he was able to reconstruct them, which is why we can benefit from reading them today. Oddly enough, the church historians redact documents that relate to temple work and ceilings and polygamy and stuff, but this overtly anti-American, anti-human document is completely unredacted, and it's transcribed for anybody to read at their pleasure. I encourage you to go read some passages from the Council of 50 minute book by clicking on the link in any of the episodes where we discuss the Council of 50, or just listen to those episodes. Episodes 159, 163, 168, 169, 170, 189, 197, 198, 199, 201, 204, 213, and 214. Before Joe went to his death in Carthage, he couldn't resist one last defiant boast against his enemies. With Nauvoo under martial law and the Nauvoo Legion mustered in full regalia to defend the city to start the Illinois Mormon Civil War, Joe made his last public address as the first prophet of the Mormons, which is recorded in the history of the church and captured in a painting from the 1880s that we've discussed a few times on the show. He began by warning the saints that their enemies didn't just want his blood, they wanted the blood of all of the Mormons. The enemies are at the gates. Only complete and total cohesion behind your prophet will save you. I am the only person who can save you. I'm the only person who can fix all of the problems that, incidentally, Joe had caused for them to begin with. Then he laid out the case for Mormon innocence that he had attempted to make in a letter to Governor Ford, who dismantled each argument in totality. Quote, "I call God, angels, and all men to witness that we are innocent of the charges which are heralded forth through the public prints against us by our enemies," us versus them, "and while they assemble together in unlawful mobs to take away our rights and destroy our lives, they think to shield themselves under the refuge of lies, which they have thus wickedly fabricated." He then called upon his followers to fight alongside him. "Will you stand by me to the death and sustain at the peril of your lives the laws of our country and the liberties and privileges which our fathers have transmitted unto us, sealed with their sacred blood?" "Aye," shouted thousands. He then said, "It is well. If you had not done it, I would have gone out there," pointing to the west, "and would have raised up a mightier people." Drawing his sword and presenting it to heaven, he said, "I call God and angels to witness that I have unsheathed my sword with a firm and unalterable determination that this people shall have their legal rights, and be protected from mob violence, or my blood shall be spilt upon the ground like water, and my body consigned to the silent tomb. While I live, I will never tamely submit to the dominion of cursed mobocracy. I would welcome death rather than submit to this oppression, and it would be sweet, oh sweet, to rest in the grave rather than submit this oppression, agitation, annoyance, confusion, and alarm upon alarm any longer. I do not regard my own life. I am ready to be offered a sacrifice for this people. For what can our enemies do? Only kill the body, and then their power is at an end. Stand firm, my friends. Never flinch. Do not seek to save your lives, for he that is afraid to die for the truth will lose eternal life. End quote. Why do we study Joseph Smith? What makes his legacy and story so enigmatic and appealing? What makes a charismatic figure just that, a charismatic figure? I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I don't think I'm ever going to be able to figure it out. Joe refused to be a footprint in the sand. He took great pains to ensure he'd be spoken of for good and evil for generations to come. There's something raw and human about his story that compels us to pay attention. Love him or hate him, we can't look away from the prophet. We're attracted to people who are confident, especially to a fault. A person like this with absolutely no altruistic or even redeeming qualities can overcome any amount of negativity, internal or external, with enough hubris. 1,000 hit pieces can be written about a public figure like this, and their many exploits of inhumanity. People called him a modern Muhammad in a derogatory way, yet he took pride in it. People called him a heaven-daring wretch, and he went on to fabricate theology that other Christians consider absolute heresy. He flaunted the law, and when people attempted to make him accountable, he exclaimed that they were denying his rights as an American citizen. We see figures so filled with brazen and unashamed confidence like Joe, and we think, oh, they must be doing something right to be so successful. We see survival benefits to these figures, and we attach ourselves to them in hopes that we'll enjoy some fraction of the prosperity that they have. To bring this to a sharper point and to capture the overall thesis of today's show, Joseph Smith did a lot. He had a lot of accomplishments for which he was proud. Many of those accomplishments required flaunting laws and acquiring property and wealth from his followers, incurring debt that he never intended on repaying, theft, secrecy, secret combinations, and death oaths for revealing those secrets, assassination squads, committing treason against the nation, which granted him the liberties to form his own religion, commodifying women and sexuality to an even greater extent than the culture in which he lived. All of that is to say, he was a bad guy, but he was an ambitious and successful bad guy. He was a bad guy who accomplished so much and bragged every step of the way that he did it. That arrogance, that conceit, and his inability to ever admit fault in many ways is a key to the guy's charisma and appeal. We love to hate people we don't understand, especially when they revel in the fact that we can never know their history. Just because a person is proud of their achievements or boasts about what they've accomplished, that doesn't say much about who they are or their character. It's what those achievements and accomplishments are to begin with that says much more about who that person is. Joe boasted of his abilities to lead a cult with no remorse and the least amount of real work necessary. He boasted about flaunting laws and never being held accountable. He boasted about raising armies and committing treason. He boasted about knowing unknown languages and mysteries in the face of being repeatedly proven wrong. He boasted about the thousands of people who risked life and limb to follow him and all of the suffering that he forced upon them. He boasted about hiding his teenage consorts from his first wife, Emma. It's not the boasting itself, but what the boasting is about that's at issue. To quote a conversation that Jackson had with Joe, quote, "He continued to talk about his wife until my anger got the better of my prudence, and then I told him he must stop such conversation to me, and that I would not hear him rail out on so worthy a woman as I believed Emma to be, and threaten to knock him down if he did not cease. I told him he was a damned rascal, and he thought every other man as black-hearted as himself. At the same time, I accused him of living in fornication with other women, and that he especially should hold his peace in regard to Emma. To these aspersions he made no angry retort, but would not at that time own that he lived in fornication with other women, and said he was a godly man in every act, but that Emma was jealous of him. He then asked me if I had ever known him to do anything wrong with the women. I replied that I had not, but that in my opinion, any man that was base enough to concoct schemes for pillage and murder as he had done would lie with his mother if she would permit him." End quote. I'm proud of the 6 years of serialized podcasting it's taken us to get here. I hope you're ready, listeners. The time is nigh at hand to finally bury this motherfucker. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.